Hello, everybody. So we'll just give a little bit of time for people to join in. So the way that this is going to work is I will just kind of go over my general study suggestions with some insight as to how it might be different for an online course compared to face-to-face classes. Sorry, I'm getting feedback on my end because I've still got my volume on. There we go. With a little insight about how it might be different for online class compared to face-to-face as we go through this. If you have questions, feel free to ask those questions in the chat, and I will be more than happy to address them as they come up. Or if it is something that I think I will cover later, I will just press pause on that and come back to it when I feel the time is right. Now, I'll just point out that a lot of what I will be talking about tonight, of course, Ted's Boots is here. A lot of what I'll be talking about tonight is stuff that I've already provided to you. You know, my intent in this course is not just to teach you psychology, it's to teach you how psychology can be useful. And to that end, I've been providing you with information about, you know, how we can use our understanding of psychology to help us to better remember information and process information and retrieve that information later on. I've also provided you with the study tips document straight away from the start of the semester that you know, provides a lot of the insights that I'll be talking about tonight, but perhaps talking about it will assist you more than having just read it. But I guess we'll just get going. It doesn't look like any more people are kind of coming in here. We're at 14, and it's been 14 since I started rambling here. So again, if you have questions, feel free to ask those questions. I'm more than happy to answer them. Now, you know, kind of the two, or the main thing to think about is, like, what are you doing now? Like, what is the approach that you're taking? And if you're here tonight, that approach is not working. Okay, so whatever you've been doing has not been working for you, and therefore we need to think about what we can do differently. And when I normally have these conferences with students face-to-face, the first thing I ask them is, like, what do you do? So what do you do to study? What are the approaches that you take? And if y'all want to go ahead and just, like, throw that into the comments, you know, what are the things that you do to study? What are the typical approaches that you take? What are the strategies that you use, the techniques that you use, so that I can just get a sense of kind of what y'all are doing. And, you know, now that we've only got like 13 people here, I kind of wish it was over Zoom instead. Make a Quizlet, study it, then read through my notes and try to explain it all to myself, okay? Memorization, Quizlet, repetition, study the modules, usually focus on what things are, but not really the application, okay? Took notes from the lectures, then the book. Look over my notes, use a Quizlet, okay? Highlight and annotate notes, connect the notes, take notes and memorize, watch the videos again. So a couple of things that I'm seeing here, read the chapters, write vocab, okay? Make note cards, all my notes, okay. All right, a couple of things I'm seeing. A lot of these strategies are kind of the tried and true things that you've probably used in the past that have been very effective for you, perhaps through a high school, in some other college courses perhaps. But a lot of these are not necessarily going to be effective with regard to studying for this course, okay? And part of it is, what I see here is a lot of strategies that are aimed at trying to take the large amount of content that is presented to you and distilling it down to a smaller chunk of information that is, it seems more manageable, right? So that's a lot of the times what people are doing when they're doing note cards, when they highlight, when they take notes, things like that. And that is something that I will address a little bit later on, okay? Another thing to think about, besides just the things that you're doing, is when do you start, right? When do you start studying? And that's another thing that I oftentimes ask people, and I say, be honest. Tell me what you're actually doing. And what most people will tell me in my sessions with them is, I start like the night before, 2 nights before, 3 nights before. Sometimes they'll be like, well, I start a whole week ahead of time. And I'm like, well, we should be starting earlier than that. Okay. There's this tendency to want to cram. And I understand the motivation for that, right? Because when you're looking at a test, you're like, I want the information to be fresh. And so I should study right before the exam. I should try to get it all in at once, and then it'll be fresh in memory. I'll be able to vomit it all out on the test, and I'll do well. The problem with that is that when you're being asked to differentiate between your stream is freezing up, or is that happening to other people? I need to know if that's happening for other people. Or is it just Olivia here who's having that? No? Okay. Olivia, try closing down some other programs on your computer. Okay. Or see if there's any way to change the settings to reduce the resolution of the video feed. That could help. All right, but you want to have it all fresh so that you can just kind of like spit it out on the test. The problem is, as we talked about in this last module, in module 6, encoding specificity principle, when you process a lot of information in short sequence, one right after the other, it all gets connected. Okay, and consequently, when you get to the exam, then everything comes out all at once. It comes out as kind of like retrieval vomit. Okay, it all comes out as one big chunk of information, and you're not able to differentiate between the concepts. The other problem with cramming is that you feel rushed. Okay, and when we feel rushed, we get this tendency to go through information really quickly. And when we go through information really quickly, not only does that mix everything up, it also means that you're not devoting a lot of attention to the material. You're kind of passively and quickly processing information. You're holding it in working memory for maybe like 10 seconds and then moving on to the next thing, and then the next thing, and the next thing, and the next thing. So you're not really deeply processing the information. And the unfortunate thing is, it's much more fatiguing to do it that way. Okay? So you're not taking advantage of your memory. You're passively processing the information. It's all going to come out at the same time. It is exhausting. And the other problem with that approach is, I bet many of you probably had a couple of tests last week. Not just my test. You probably had at least one other, maybe 2 or 3 others. Because we all kind of go on the same schedule. It's kind of natural to have, Izzy B saying that she had 3 last week. Like, that's daunting. Okay, that is all. I remember in college, there were semesters where I had like 3 tests and a massive term paper due all at one time. And there's just no way that you can expect yourself to be able to learn all the information across all your classes in a couple days' time. You just can't do that. So what are we to do instead? What are we to do instead? Well, I think you all know the answer to that one. We start much earlier, right? We start weeks in advance. For exam 3, you started yesterday. That's what you do. You spread it out. Now with that, what we have to fight against is the effect of the transience of memory. That memory will fade, right? But we talked about how to deal with that in that particular module when we talked about the month of Classtober, right? I was really upset that I did not get to I love presenting the idea of the month of Classtober live. But with the month of Classtober, memory will fade with time. And memory will fade dependent on how long you process that information, how deeply you process that information, and how many times you process that information. So if you only process it once very passively, so you're not really attending to it, it fades really quickly. If you give more attention to it, it fades slower. If you rehearse that information at a later time, you delay the transience effect, and it also strengthens that memory. Okay? So what that suggests to us is that for us to take advantage of a spaced out schedule over a long period of time, we want to make sure that I'll get to that question in a second. We want to make sure that we take the time to deeply process the information when we're being exposed to it, especially that first time, because that's the one that you're likely to spend the most attention on. You probably find yourself the second or third time going through it, you're just kind of like, oh, I've already read this before. So that first time you want to devote a lot of attention to it, okay? And then you want to come back and review it later on that day, as well as maybe the next day again. Get 2 rehearsals of that information in before moving on to new information. And what I would suggest to that, and let me just read this question real quick. On the topic of procrastination, I feel like I tend to procrastinate and don't rehearse the information as much because of my poor time management skills. Could you address this time management? Yes, I'm going to address time management right now. Okay, I will just do that for you. I was a bad procrastinator in college. Okay, I always, if I didn't do as well as I would have liked to on a test, I was always like, well, I'm going to study more. And then I always found myself, oh, it's the day before the exam. Now I got to do it. And the problem is that many of you are probably making a goal intention right now. You're saying, I want to study more. And we actually, I think we talk about this at the end of this the emotion lecture module in the coping section. But you might make the goal intention, I want to study more. And then you come home that night and you're like, oh, I'm too tired. I'll do it tomorrow. And then you get home tomorrow and you're like, I'm too tired. I'll do it tomorrow. So you keep on pushing it off. Instead, what you want to make is what's called an implementation intention. And that's just a fancy way of saying making a plan, okay? And being as specific as possible with that plan, all right? The more specific you are with your plan, the more likely you are to actually follow through with it, okay? Would it help us to dedicate a lot of time at first and then use note cards and Quizlets? Well, I'll talk about note cards and Quizlets separately. But what I would say is not necessarily spending a lot of time up front and then little time later on. You want to space your time out over time, okay? You want to get into a regular schedule and develop a regular habit of studying, okay? Especially for many of you who are probably here because your grades are much lower than you expect it to be. You probably want to be studying for this class every day. Okay, now I'm not saying you're going to be, breaking your back spending hours studying every day, okay? But half-hour chunks, maybe twice a day, okay, to try to learn the material better for the next exam. But here's what I suggest. Okay, we'll deal with that in a second. Here's what I suggest to you all, okay? This class was originally going to be a face-to-face class. When you signed up for it, there was a time slot that this class was supposed to meet, okay? That's an hour, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Well, 50 minutes, but you got the 10-minute break, right, between classes, okay? 50 minutes Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Schedule that time to be the time that you're going to take your first perusal through the lecture module, okay? And what I recommend doing is breaking it up into thirds. And we've tried to help you with that by generally having 3 lecture pages per module. Sometimes it's 2. Sometimes it's like 2 in this weird little half like this one is right now. But usually you have those from early on in the week, so you can kind of start getting a sense of how much you need to go through. And really what I would suggest is just that first day, try to get through as much as you can at a good, slow pace, where you're attending to the information in a way that allows you to really think about it and ask yourself important questions like, do I even understand this? Okay? So on Monday, yesterday, you would have probably had about the time to get through maybe 2/3 of the first page, 2/3 of that first emotion page. That one was pretty long, okay? And then that night, maybe you have a half-hour set aside and you put it in your planner, you put it in your calendar, specifically, 3:30, I don't have anything to do. So what 3:30 is going to be is I'm going to be in my apartment studying and reviewing the psychology materials that I looked at that day, okay? And then you do another one of those or maybe 2 of those the next day, 2 half-hour sessions, maybe 1 in the morning, 1 in the afternoon. And then Wednesday you come back and you do the next third of the material, okay? You get through about 1/3 of the lecture material and then go review it that night, review it the next day, and then Friday you get through the last third and then review it that night and maybe go back and do 1 session where you review a lot of it over the weekend. And in that way, you're making a plan. okay? You're scheduling it out and you're holding yourself to that schedule. That is going to be the only way that you can fight against procrastination. You can't just like, procrastination's gone. I'm sorry, it doesn't work that way. You have to make a schedule, hold yourself to it, and kind of force yourself to do it. And what you will find, and this is the nice thing about taking this approach where you're scheduling it in, you're making a plan, and you're doing it regularly, is that eventually it will become habitual. It will be what you do. It will be what's typical. When I first started developing the content for this semester, it was summer. I don't normally work to the level that I was going to have to during the summer. Plus, my daughter was home, so we were having to take care of her a lot. So when I first started doing this, it had been like 3 weeks since I had really been regularly working, and I was out of the habit of working. So when I first started doing it, it was really hard to force myself to do anything. I was having to like force myself to hunker down in my office and grind away at the work. But now I've gotten into the habit where it's very much, I get done with my morning routine. I take Sydney to daycare. I get home and I'm like, oh, it's time to sit down at my computer and start answering emails and then starting to write some content for the next week's lectures. Okay. You get into a habit and it makes it easier. That's not to say that it will ever be just like you're doing it and it's no problem. But if you don't set a schedule, you'll never get there. Okay. Okay. I will come to your thought in a second there, MKK0027. Okay. And let's talk about some other things. All right. For me, I feel like I spent most of the time trying to organize all the information in the book to make sure I have all of it down. Process, not study as much as I should. So that's an interesting comment right there. Okay. Because my next topic here is helping your attention. Okay. Helping your attention. And this is important. We talked basically the whole last section. A major theme was attention is important, because if you don't attend to things, you don't perceive things. If you don't attend to things, you can't learn things about them. If you don't attend to things, you can't remember things. Okay? Attention is an important and necessary criteria for all of those processes. Okay? So we need to work to help our attention. So a couple of things before I get to some of the comments that have been put in the stream here. But, online time, and this is one of the big challenges this semester, is that online time for us much of the time is passive time. It is an inherently passive process, okay? We do not spend a lot of attention when we're looking around online, when we're looking through, and I don't know what the new social networks are, TikTok, but like Facebook, Twitter, when we're going through that, we're not really paying attention to stuff. We're looking for something to grab our attention, right? We're not looking to give attention. We're looking to have our attention grabbed. And consequently, most of us kind of get into this mindset when we're looking at our computers that we don't really need to pay attention to it. And that's something you have to fight against while you're looking through this content. And there's also a lot of distractions that will come up when you've got a computer that's hooked up to the interwebs, okay? You'll get notifications, you'll get buzzed by things. There's the temptation to always go and look at something more interesting because it's just a couple of clicks away. You likely will have your phone sitting on your desk and you might be getting texts and notifications from your friends. There are all these things buzzing off that are trying to draw you away from focusing on studying. Get rid of those things, okay? Turn your phone off and throw it in the other room. Well, don't throw it, it'll break. Get it in the other room so that it's not a temptation. Turn notifications off on your computer. You can do that. Close out your email program. Okay, I have to do that oftentimes when I'm writing for this class and for these lecture modules and making videos, because if I don't, I'm getting emails from you guys all the time, and I'm tempted to just want to respond to those emails right away. And I apologize if sometimes it takes me a while, but that's me turning off my email so that I can focus on my work, because it happens to me too, okay? It happens to all of us. Attention is a difficult thing. Our attentional systems are not meant to pay attention to things for long periods of time. They're meant to pay attention to things for a minute or two, okay? The length of our working memory span. So we have to help our attention. One thing is that we want to study in short sessions because we get fatigued, okay? This is one of the big problems with cramming. When we cram, we study for hours on end, okay? And when we study for hours on end, there are what we call diminishing returns. The longer you study, the less you gain from studying in one session. So you can probably go about 20, 25 minutes and you're getting a good benefit with regard to your memory from that. But once you get past 25 minutes, your attention is starting to wane. You're going to start feeling fatigued. And the information that you're processing at that point, the amount of memory you get out of that decreases dramatically. Okay, dramatically. So that's why we recommend people study for 25 minutes with a plan to take a break for about 10 to 15 minutes and then get back to it again, maybe for a 15 to 20 minute session. Okay, if you're trying to do these marathon sessions, you're not really benefiting yourself. So you want to break it into smaller sections. And the only way you can do that, again, is by spreading it out over a longer period of time, starting earlier rather than cramming at the end. Okay. With regard to one of the things that a lot of you are saying, you're trying to help yourself get it down to a smaller bit of information. And like you're doing that because you're trying to help your attention in some way. Okay. So some people are saying they try to organize all the information to make sure you have it all down. But when you're doing that, you're not really processing the information. That's absolutely correct. So Sam and Diego, that is absolutely correct. A lot of study strategies that people use are essentially trying to grab information out, what you think is important, okay? What you think is worthy of your attention, and then you put that into some format that you can go through it quickly, okay? The problem is when you do that, as you're saying here, you're not really processing the information. You're not thinking about it. And one of the things I've noticed this semester, and one of the things I've been trying to do when I've been talking to people is looking at page views. So how much time people are spending on the lecture module. Now, what I'm not trying to do is to say that those people aren't studying, because they tell me they're studying. And I trust them that they are studying. You know, when I'm talking to them, they look tired. So something's making them tired. I assume it's studying. But then when I start talking to them, it turns out that what they're doing is they kind of go to the lecture module, they search for the information that they think they need, and then they spend a lot of time studying that stuff that they pulled out. But since they didn't take the time to understand it the first time they were going through it, when they were looking through the lecture module, what they've pulled out is just these little bits and pieces of information, these small bits and pieces, which should sound familiar. That's what we do when we automatically encode information. When we passively attend to information, we only get these small bits and pieces. And then when we try to retrieve that later on, we have to fill in all those missing gaps. Well, that's the same thing that you're doing when you're reviewing those small bits and pieces. You're taking the little bit of information that you have from the lecture module, and then you're trying to make sense of it by using like your reasoning or your logic. But I'm not going to test you on the sense that you can make out of the stuff that you've pulled out of the lecture module. I'm going to test you on what's in the lecture module, okay? So what I would discourage you from doing, and this is going to sound bonkers, but what I would discourage you from doing is trying to use that approach, trying to write everything down, trying to take all of these notes about the material that are your version of what I've written, at least at first. That first time, and I mentioned this in the how to take notes in an online class announcement, that the first time you're going through that material, give it your full attention. Don't try to distill it down into a small set of notes, okay? Don't hunt for the highlighted terms and their definitions. Don't pull that information out and then study that information over and over and over again. Pay attention to the lecture module. Pay attention to the videos, okay? And if you do that, you'll gain a greater understanding of that material. And then maybe you go through again and then write that down. Take notes, condense it down in some way if that's what you're used to doing, okay? But gain a greater understanding of it first before you try to condense it down. And this is all part of giving it your full attention, If you don't attend to that information, if you don't process that information, it's never going to get in, and it's not going to be in your notes. And consequently, no matter how many times you go over those notes over and over again, it's never going to be there. You're never going to get the answers out of that. You're never going to better understand something that you didn't understand in the first place by repeating the limited understanding of it that you had the first time. Okay? All right. So somebody's saying that they did that and it worked really well on the second exam, and that's why I make these suggestions. Is that, and I'm not going to say it works for everybody every time, but this stuff does it can be really helpful in changing your perspective and changing the approach that you take. So thank you for that, HJT0009. That is not me just secretly typing on the side here and pretending to be a person, or is it? Okay. Another thing to keep in mind is the mind frame that you're taking to the material, okay? So a lot of people are like, well, I need to remember everything. And I'm seeing that a lot in the comments over here. I need to remember everything, or I try to remember everything. You don't need to remember everything. You don't. A lot of the stuff that we put in there, you don't need to remember at all. Because a lot of the stuff, I spend most of my time writing stuff and making videos about stuff that you don't need to remember. I spent 2 minutes talking about why it's Looney Tunes, Tunes, and not Tunes, Toons. I spent 2 minutes talking about that in a video. And that, by the way, that section of that video took me like an hour to make. I'm really bad at making videos. But it was not for you to remember that fact. You probably will remember that fact for many years, hopefully. But it was not for you to remember that fact. It was to demonstrate a point. Okay, it was to demonstrate the difference between automatic processing and encoding versus effortful encoding. That if we take the time to work towards learning and understanding, our memory for that information is so much better than if we just try to repeat it over and over again in a very passive way. Okay, we're providing you with examples, with studies to help you to see how these concepts work and how they apply. All right. So don't spend your time trying to remember, like in this particular section, the one that you should have been looking over the last couple of days in the emotion, there's the Schachter two-factor study, which is a very, very detailed study with lots of different steps. I don't expect you to remember the Schachter two-factor study. I am very unlikely to give you that exact same study and ask you what happened. Instead, I'll give you another example of that and ask you which theory best predicts that. And if you understand Schachter two-factor theory, because you use that study to understand how that all works, then you can see that more easily. And even if I gave you the Schachter two-factor study again, you wouldn't have to remember it because you understand how Schachter two-factor theory works. And therefore, you could reason out what would likely happen based on that understanding. So you don't have to remember those things. You use them to help your studying. Okay? Sometimes I work better when there are discussions because I'm able to see things in a different and sometimes better way. I feel like this is the biggest obstacle in online classes. Well, I will tell you right now that you would not have gotten that in a face-to-face version of this class either. This class has 160 people in face-to-face. It is normally just me lecturing for 15 minutes. And I will tell you, I usually get about 3 questions the entire semester. And they're usually the same question. Okay? So that is not something that is of online classes. It's a problem with large, broad survey courses, okay? Now, we do have smaller sections of this that are a little bit more discussion focused, but this is intro psychology, so we tend to not get into a lot of discussion. And that's also what the pack-back discussion boards are for, okay? That's an opportunity for you to talk about the material, ask questions that you have, get feedback from other people, and to discuss that information in a deeper way so that you can process and think about it. I would also encourage you to get together and talk about the information in that way as well, okay? And yeah, absolutely, discussing the material can help you to gain a deeper understanding. We are not expecting you to get that deep of an understanding of this information, however, okay? We don't want you to, we don't necessarily expect you to be at the level of being able to talk about it in a deep and sophisticated way. And we don't intend to teach that because, first of all, it's too many students to be able to do that. But also, we know that for most students, that is not their goal with this class, okay? But yeah, I mean, if we could deeply discuss it, you would perhaps get a deeper understanding of it, but then we would test it in a deeper way as well, not in the way that we are testing it. Okay. Now, another thing for getting into that the right mindset is that, you know, starting off, you want to be focused on how you're going to be tested. Okay. And how you're going to be tested is with a multiple choice test, which I know everybody's like, yay, that's so easy, but you've learned that is not the case, right? And that's because multiple choice tests can be written to be very easy, or they can be written to be effective means of testing understanding, testing your capability to differentiate between 2 or 3 very similar concepts. And you should be taking that mindset into when you study. If you're going to be asked a question that requires you to know the difference between concept A and concept B, when you're looking through the materials, you should be thinking, well, here's concept A, here's another concept. Those two seem really similar to one another. Those two seem like things that I would confuse with one another. I should probably spend some time thinking about how they're different as well as how they're the same. Okay? Because, let me just see if I can bring this up real quick. See how my computer is really chugging right now, so I don't know if I'm going to be able to get this going. It takes a lot of computer power to stream. I don't know, these people on Twitch, they must have amazing computers, because I got a brand new Mac book, or not MacBook, but Mac Mini for this, and it is very, very high powered, and it chugs at this. It slows down when I'm recording or streaming. Okay, but when I write a question, let's see if I can bring this up. I want to show you how I write a question. Okay. Boom, right there. Okay. How do I write a question? Well, I write a question by starting with the answer. Okay. So I pick an answer to my question, right? That's where I start. And, you know, each semester, I when I'm developing a new class, are you all seeing sensory memory? There, it finally came up there. Okay. When I'm starting a new class, when I'm developing a new class, when I'm starting to develop the material, which meant this semester we were doing this to some extent, although this is based on our previous classes, I try to think, well, what am I gonna test? Okay, what are the concepts that I'm gonna test? What are the answers to my questions? So I find an answer, okay, and then I find something that I think you will be likely to confuse it with, okay? Those are going to be the distractor items for that question. So if sensory memory is one of the answers, the other answers are going to be things like working memory and long-term memory. Those are the close distractors, okay? And then maybe there's like a fourth one that I throw in there that is what we might call a distant distractor, or oftentimes I make like a dumb joke or pun or something like that for the fourth answer. That's the one that you can just throw away. And then based on this, I look at the right answer, and then I look at the wrong answers, the close distractors, and I ask myself, what do these things have in common? What's different between them? And then I use that to write the stem of the question. The stem of the question is the bulk of the question. It's what the question is asking, okay? And in the stem of that question, it will have a piece of information that distinguishes the right answer from the wrong answer, okay? It will also, however, include information sometimes, not always, but sometimes it will include information that the right answer shares with the wrong answer, okay? For you to be able to get this question right, for you to be able to answer a question like this, you can't just know what sensory memory is and what working memory is and what long-term memory is and what prospective memory is. You have to know how sensory memory compares to the other ones. You have to know what it shares in common, because if you know what they share in common, when you see that information, the highlighted in red here, the information that the answer shares with the close distractors, when you see that information, you will be like, oh, that could be working memory, sensory memory, and long-term memory. I know it's not prospective memory. We'll cut that one out. But while that information is correct for sensory memory, it is also correct for those other ones as well. And this is what can sometimes happen, is that you just study what sensory memory is, and you see the information that is in red that is true for sensory memory, but it's also true for working memory. And you see that, and maybe it makes you think of working memory first. So you get that information, and you go, okay, well, I think it's working memory. I'll answer working memory. I'll get on to the next question. But you never took the time to ask yourself, is that also true of sensory memory? Is that also true of long-term memory? Which it was. If you thought about that, and if you knew that those things were things that those three concepts have in common with one another, you would know not to pay as much attention to that information, that there must be something else you should be looking for. You should be looking for that piece of information right there that actually represents a difference between these concepts. Okay, the thing that helps you to distinguish between sensory memory, working memory, and long-term memory. And when you're taking the test, you should be thinking about that as well. Okay, so you read the STEM, and maybe you're like, well, it's not prospective memory, but it could be sensory, working memory, or long-term memory. I need to remind myself, well, what were the differences that I remember studying between those things? Let me go back to the STEM of the question and see if any of that information is in there. I don't want to look for the similarities, I want to look for the differences. But the problem is, that information is not going to be there unless you put it in at the beginning, when you were encoding. And that's what I mean by taking that particular mindset to the lecture materials. When you're looking over the content, you shouldn't just be saying, well, I need to know this, and then I need to know this, and then I need to know this. You should be asking yourself, well, here's this, what's the difference between them? What are the things that when I get to the exam and I see one of these questions that I can use, the useful information that I can use to differentiate between the right answer and the wrong answer on these questions? And because we think about this ahead of time, I have set up the lecture modules oftentimes to emphasize that information, okay? You will see me oftentimes saying, we talked about this earlier, that it's very similar to this new concept that we're introducing, or these two concepts are very similar to one another. Here is how they are different. Here is how they are the same. I'm providing you that information because that's what I want you to know. So make sure you're attending to that information. Because if you don't, again, if you don't attend to that information, if you don't study that information, if you don't process that information, it's not going to be there when you're taking the test. Okay? So Kristen here is asking, I feel like I'm spending a lot of time on the material, but the amount of time isn't matching up with my knowledge of the material. How do I keep from getting bogged down and study more efficiently? Well, here's another thing to think about. A lot of the strategies, I talked about this earlier, you're trying to take a large amount of information and distill it down into a smaller parcel of information that you need to study. But perhaps you're not doing that in an effective way, where maybe you're like, well, I'll just learn the definitions and then that'll be enough. Well, that's not enough. Okay. Instead, well, how do we get that large bulk of information down to a smaller piece of information? Well, instead of focusing on like a kind of information that I want to focus on, let's focus on level of understanding. Okay. One of the things that you should be thinking about that first time you go through the lecture module, as you go through each section, and we've broken it up into little paragraphs, and sometimes it's a tab and then a tab and then a tab, or an expander, then an expander, then an expander. Each time you do one of those little clicks, or each time you see a new heading, stop for a second before moving on to the next one and ask yourself, did I understand that? Did that make sense to me? Okay. If it did make sense to you, that's great to know. That's good information. If it did not make sense to you, make note of that. That is very important to know, okay? Because that is the information that you're going to want to come back to. That is the information that when you're taking the large bulk of information and trying to distill it down into a small parcel of information that you need to study, that's the information that is in your small parcel. Because if you think about it, if you read over something and it's just plain common sense and it makes sense to you right away and you understand it completely, but you never say, well, I know that, I understand that. Well, then you're going to keep on going back and you're going to study it again and again. And this when you continue to include that information, that can result in kind of the glassy-eyed effect of the second or third or fourth time you're going through the lecture material, where you're like, oh, this is so dull. I've studied this before. I already get this. Well, that's because you're focusing on the information that you already know, that you already understand, and you're wasting your time on that stuff, okay? Because if you study something that if you're at like 95% level comprehension on it, and then you study it for an hour, you get up to 96% comprehension of it, you have not really increased your chances of getting a question correct. You haven't, because you already understood it. You just understand it a little bit better and you put a lot of effort into that, okay? On the other hand, if you identify the things that you're struggling with and you take note of that, well, that's the stuff that you should be studying, because you might be at 50% comprehension of it now, and spending an hour studying it, it's not going to get you up to 96% comprehension, but maybe it'll get you up to 70% comprehension. That's a much bigger jump. And consequently, you're increasing your probability of getting a question correct to a much greater degree. And what the research on studying shows, and there actually is studies of studying, okay? But what it shows is that when people focus on how well do I understand this material, yes, at first, it makes them feel less confident in their knowledge, okay? Absolutely, that's going to happen, because since you're taking note of your lack of understanding, you're like, oh no, I don't understand this, okay? But what we find is that when people focus on how well they understand the concept, that then changes how they study, and consequently, they tend to start improving, okay? Just that simple change in approach to, I want to start out by thinking, how well do I understand something? And the other benefit of that is if you know that you don't understand it, you can come ask questions about it. You can come to my office hours or the TA's office hours, or you can come to the Twitch streams on Thursday prepared with questions to ask me, and I will help you to understand that concept better. You know, one of the things that students oftentimes struggle with is the classical conditioning stuff. And, you know, I've had students come into my office hours and like, I've been studying this for like 10 hours. I still don't get it. We talk about it for 15 minutes and we figure out what they were missing. But until that person comes and talks to me about it or asks me that question, we don't know how to figure out what they're missing, okay? I've tried to learn lessons from those interactions from students and incorporate that information into the lecture modules, but there's no guarantee that I'm addressing the issue that you're having. So as you're going through the material, focus on how much you understand something and how poorly you understand something. If you don't understand it well, write it down. Take note of it, okay? One of the things that I used to do when I was in college, which it's been a while, okay, but I would mark up the study objectives for the section, and it would end up looking, here we go, looking something like this. I just mocked this up today, but it would look something like this, okay, where the concepts that I understood really well were highlighted in green, the ones that I kind of understood were in yellow, the ones that I really didn't understand were in red, so that I knew these are the things I need to study. I'll get to these, and this stuff I don't need to care about, okay? I also wrote up questions, and I would put those questions in the study guide, so I knew to ask those the next time the class met or when I went to go talk to my TA during office hours. I knew to ask those questions, or I knew to try to answer those questions for myself by looking through the various materials for the course, okay? Trying to figure out what you understand and don't understand will give you focus. It will help you to take the large amount of information that is available and distill it down into a smaller parcel of information, and you'll be doing that in a way that's actually going to help you work towards focusing and increasing your comprehension level to actually improve your performance on the test, okay? Let me get rid of that because it's bugging me, okay? The opposite of this is when you like highlight the lecture module, or you highlight in your textbook, where basically what you're trying to do is you're trying to eliminate information to just focus on important information. When people do that, they oftentimes just highlight the stuff that's already highlighted, and then they miss all that important information that can help them to understand it. Don't highlight in that way. Highlight in a way that is useful for thinking about what should I study, okay? Do I have any tips on second guessing on a question? Absolutely. Get the information in there in the first place, okay? You're not going to second guess yourself if you're studying the material in the right way. Okay. The other thing I will say is, if you are second guessing yourself on a question, take the two answers that you're currently looking between. Okay. So if it's answer A and answer B, you're like, I don't know which one this is. I think it's A, but maybe it's B. Stop for a moment and ask yourself, what's the difference between those two things? Okay. What is the difference between those? And then look to see if that information is in the question. You know, a lot of students, they read the question and then they look to the answers and they stay with the answers. Go back to the question. Okay. The question is what's providing you with the information to identify what the answer is. If all you do is read the question, then read the answers, you're relying on your memory of the question. And that's not good. Okay. Because when you're relying on your memory, you're filling in gaps. Okay. And again, ultimately, the big thing is it's got to be in there in the first place. A lot of the times when you're second guessing yourself on the question, it's because you don't have the information you need to answer that question. So another thing to think about working towards the level of understanding is when you're taking the quizzes. Now, I know we took the feedback away on the quizzes. We've given you back to that back for these quizzes. So yay. But even without that feedback, you could self-assess how well you understood a concept, because I'm willing to guess that there are questions where you get them right and you still didn't understand that concept. You just got lucky, or you guessed right. Okay? If you read over a question and you look at the answers and you have to think about it for a while, if you're like, I don't know, maybe it's A, maybe it's B, I don't know, and you put A and that ends up being the right answer, you didn't understand that question. You didn't understand why A was right and B was wrong. You just went with one of your options. That's something you need to study more. And that's why getting that feedback, it can be helpful to know what questions you got wrong, but it can be misleading because there are questions that you got right that you still need to study those concepts. So when you're taking those quizzes, and I will tell you, y'all need to take more time on those quizzes. You're taking like 4 minutes to answer 10 questions. It's like 20 to 30 seconds per question. That's not enough time to think about and process those questions, okay? I give you 20 minutes because I want you to take 20 minutes. I want you to take that time to read through the question deeply, to think about that question, think about your level of understanding of that question, and think about whether you can come up with a good answer to that question, okay? It's 10 questions, 2 minutes per question. On the test, you get 40 questions. You got 60 minutes, so you get 1.5 minutes per question. When y'all are taking the test, you aren't taking the full time either. You're trying to get it, most of you get it done in like 25 to 35 minutes. You got 15 to 25 minutes left. Take the time to read the question, slow yourself down, ask yourself, what is this question asking? Okay? It's the same thing with encoding requires attention, retrieving requires attention too. Okay. Kind of covered a lot of what I intended to talk about in kind of a piecemeal way. Oh, another thing with that, the level of understanding, like if you keep a list of what you do understand and what you don't understand, update that as you go along. Because your list will be very long at the start. There'll be a lot of things likely that you don't understand. But as you work through the material, you can knock stuff off that list. Okay? If you spend a little bit more time with Schachter two-factor theory and all of a sudden it's making sense to you, move it from it being a red item to a yellow item, and hopefully maybe eventually to a green item. Okay? All right, so let me see what other questions. I'm glad that you enjoy my more creative questions. The pool cue one, yeah, that's one of my favorites. I try to do that because I know that it can be a drag to take a test and students get stressed. So I try to throw a couple of questions in there that are a little bit more interesting. And I know that does come with more text, but it's there to try to help you. So I'm glad that you do appreciate that. Okay. Let me see some other things here. Any other questions that people have? Somebody says they need a memory palace. Now, I will say the memory palace, well, it can help you to remember discrete items. doesn't work that well for understanding things deeply. So the mnemonic devices, although we talk about it in the memory chapter because like it's a trick of memory and it's a way to think about how memory can work better. Those tricks don't work that well when you're trying to really understand a concept. It can help you to remember like a list of things, but those tricks are not great for deeper understanding. Do I suggest spending time studying or to study a certain number of notes before moving on? I don't know exactly what you're asking there. What I would suggest is breaking it up into smaller parcels. I would strongly discourage you from trying to get through the whole lecture module in one go. I would strongly discourage that, okay? I think you should break it up and study it over the course of the week. I'm looking at the page views for students, and I'm seeing a lot of page views on Sunday before the quiz, not a lot earlier in the week, and I think that is hurting a lot of y'all. So break it up, and like I said, break it into thirds. Now, one thing I will say, we provide you with the textbook stuff. Textbook stuff in my classes is always just a supplement. It's just another source that you can go to look at the information to help you to better understand the content in the lecture module. And if I am going to ask you a question from the textbook, it's gonna be a very brief and not very detailed or deep question. So I would, unless it helps you to read the textbook, do not spend a lot of time with that. Read through it maybe once, and we've cut out a lot of the content from the textbook and only given you what we think is important. Okay. How much time should we spend on the textbook sections? As I'm saying, not a lot. Not a lot. Don't spend a whole lot of time on the textbook. Okay. You should be spending your time on the lecture modules. That's what we're intending to teach you this semester. And that's what we intend to teach every semester. The textbook is there to supplement what we talk about in class. Okay. There's far too much in that textbook. And the textbook that we gave you, like this is the textbook that we usually use right here. Okay. This is 700 pages. I mean, the textbook that we gave you probably has like maybe the equivalent of 200 pages. It's supplement. Okay. Yeah. See, Thompson, and I think you're making a good point there. It's not necessarily that you're not putting the effort in when you're studying. Okay. That's not necessarily the case. It might be that you're taking an approach that's it's just not working for this class. Okay. Yeah, so for learning, we gave you the examples, and the reason we give you the examples for that is it's a process. So it's easy for us to give you an example and show you how to break that down. Not everything in this class is a process like that, so we can't always give you those examples. But that's what the quizzes are intended to be, are some examples for you to go through of examples of the way that you'll be asked those questions. But when we can give you those examples, we try to do that, okay? We did that with like the drive, although it's just like thirst and hunger, but we try to do that when we can, because we know that that is helpful for you to actually work through the process and break it down. Now, what I will suggest of that is, as well, though, is you can try to do that with the examples that we give you in the text. You know, when we give you an example, stop and ask yourself, how does that show the concept? Okay. That can help you to get that same kind of experience without us doing it explicitly for you, because sometimes it would just be kind of awkward for us to do it that way. Let me see what else I got here. I'm trying to think if there's any other things that I normally tell students. Oh, the one thing I always want to say is, you know, if you're struggling with a concept and you've been looking at it and pining over it and just like going it over and over again, and it's just not making sense, just come ask us. Come to the Twitch stream, ask me questions, set up a Zoom meeting. You know, I had a lot of Zoom meetings this week, and I've still got a lot more. But the week before, which was the week before the test, I had like an hour and a half that was just empty. And the week before that, I think one person signed up for office hour Zoom meetings. One person. So take advantage of that time. And the TA as well is there to help you. She's a graduate student in our program. She actually went to Auburn. She didn't take my intro psych class, but she took one of our intro psych classes, and many of us teach much the same information. And she has a good knowledge. She got into graduate school. So she has a good knowledge of the base of psychology concepts. So use her as well, not just to look at your quizzes, but to ask questions. And she has a lot of good insight. You know, she's closer to the experience of actually taking a psychology class than I am. I haven't taken intro psychology for 18 years. My intro psychology knowledge is old enough to participate in intro psychology studies. Okay. Oh, I emphasize studying a little every day, but what advice do I have for the weeks, days leading up to the exam? That's a great question. Okay, that is a great question. The weeks and days leading up to the exam. Okay, well, you're still studying some new stuff, so you want to make sure you're parceling out time for that as well. But in the weeks and days, the last minute stuff that you're doing, you're taking out your list of understanding. Okay, you're finding those red concepts and you're going back to them. And you're asking yourself, now that I've had some time to look at some of the other content, which sometimes it helps to look at some of the later content because there's kind of these consistent themes that carry through. And I hope you saw that in the last section. I mean, who Lord, everything in that section works together. I love that section. Sensation and perception builds into learning, builds into memory. Like all that stuff works so well together. So like there might have been something in the sensation and perception lecture that didn't make a whole lot of sense to you, but by the time you get done with the memory lecture, you might be like, oh, that makes sense. So you go back to that list of what you do understand and what you don't understand, and you start trying to understand the stuff that you're struggling with. Okay. You start working on those concepts that you highlighted in red. You start trying to answer those questions, reviewing that material. And then maybe like the day before the exam, review some of the concepts that you know well, just so that that stuff is fresh, okay? That stuff is, that you remember that and how it was taught so that you're prepared to answer questions about it. And what I will say is that last day before the exam, do the exact opposite of what you're doing. Don't spend hours and hours and hours that day. You want to give your brain a little bit of a break the day before the exam. You really want to get good sleep the night before the exam. That will help you immensely. So you do not want to overload yourself the night before the exam. That's what I would suggest. Again, you're going back and reviewing the stuff that you were struggling with to make sure you're increasing your comprehension of it, trying to increase your understanding of it, and then in the like 2 to 3 days ahead of time before the exam, you're reviewing the stuff that you do know quite well. You just want to get a little refresher course on it. And then the day before the exam, you want to kind of give yourself a break and get yourself ready for that test day. Okay. Did my daughter ever get the second cookie? No. I'm not. It's a test that you're supposed to learn from. And by the way, she's 3.5 now. She's still not old enough to do the test. She's still not old enough to do the delay of gratification task. So when she turns 4, we will do it again, and we'll see how she does then. But I did record a video of her doing a task for the developmental psych lecture that she is, she's developmentally appropriate for, she's supposed to fail the test, and she failed it miserably, which I just absolutely loved because it's a really cute test. It's called the Mean Monkey Task. But you'll see that in the developmental psych lecture. And then when she's 4.5, she'll be old enough to pass that one. I'll do that one. But no, she did not get the second cookie. We need to train her to have self-control. Do I feel that it's more important to understand things in a broader conceptual sense or to understand more of the specific type things? Well, you kind of need to have a little bit of both, okay? For you to grow towards having a greater conceptual understanding of things, you have to understand the basics of it first. So, like, you need to know what sensory memory is before you can understand how information gets processed through sensory memory into working memory, okay? Now, that being said, a lot of the detail-oriented stuff that I know a lot of students like to focus on, I don't expect you to know that information, okay? Like, I don't know how many times I get asked in an email every week, do we need to know the names of the people from this chapter? No, you don't. I told you that on like the first day. You don't need to know the names of those people. You don't need to know the date that the study was published. I'm giving you that information so that you could look it up, or to provide a greater context for the information, because sometimes it's helpful to know the history. And we will see a little bit of history in the next chapter, the personality chapter. And I guess we saw a little bit in the emotion chapter as well. But I want you to understand, knowing when James Lang theory happened, I'm not going to ask you when did James and Lang come up with their theory. I'm going to ask you, well, here's a situation. Does James Lang theory apply? Okay. Or what does James Lang theory predict about that would be different than what Cannon, Bard, or Schachter, Singer would predict about that? So that's the level of understanding that I want you to focus on, is how do these things that might predict the same thing or might be very similar to one another, how do you differentiate between them? That's the level of understanding that we want you to have. We want you to see things as a larger process, okay? Yes, and I love her glasses as well. But hopefully we will be getting rid of those glasses soon, because a toddler with glasses is just a constant source of anxiety for the parents of that toddler. All right. Any other questions y'all have before we wrap this up? I've been going for an hour now, and I think my wife actually wants to spend time with me. I've seen her for like maybe 30 minutes today because we were both very busy. But any last minute questions that I can address, and I hope this was helpful for you all. Again, take the time to read through the study tips document. It's got a lot of what I went through today. Go back and read that note-taking announcement that I sent out. Review module 6. Okay. Since everybody's saying thank you, that was very helpful, and nobody's asking any questions, I'm just going to sign off. But before I do, Thursdays, Twitch streams. We go into greater detail about some of the concepts that we talk about in class. It's a great opportunity to get your questions answered. Please come with questions. Okay, please come with questions. Ask those questions straight from the start. Normally it's a little slow getting started, but once somebody asks a question, we get off and rolling and everybody's asking questions. All right, releasing practice problems. Well, we give the quizzes and we're giving you the feedback now. I can't write any more practice problems because I've got a full plate. I wish I could. I've written 150 test questions this semester already, and I've got about 150 more to write. I've got all the lecture modules. I'm sorry I can't do more than that, but we put in practice problems when we can and when it makes sense. Okay, when it makes sense, we do it. It does not always make sense. Okay. All right, everybody.